Now be honest, I know you've been looking at the ceiling, staring at that popcorn ceiling, and you're not exactly appreciating the dated look regardless of how many drywall sins were covered by that type of texture. In this video, you can learn how to protect your room with plastic, how to easily remove the existing popcorn or acoustic texture, secure any loose drywall, patch the ceiling holes, tape and bed cracks or drywall joints, and refinish the ceiling flat enough for a new texture or amazingly smooth surface to impress even the harshest critics. You'll even get an example of how long this takes and how much labor time. First, you'll want to mask off all the walls with painter's plastic and masking tape. Tape the plastic about 1/4 inch below the texture so you can get all the way to the corner or edges where there might also be some painter's caulking, and that will get peeled off in the process. A roll of painter's plastic will cost $25.68 plus tax and will cover 400 lineal feet of walls. A roll of 2-inch masking tape costs about $4.98 plus tax and is 60 yards or 180 lineal feet. You can easily do 3 rooms with this. Next, you'll want to definitely cover the flooring with a layer of plastic to collect the texture and protect the flooring from water spray and dripping. Even if you have a tile floor or a bare concrete slab, you'll still want to put plastic down on the floor to protect it so you're not having to clean this up later, slipping and sliding, or working some of that texture into the concrete pours where you may be putting some tile floor later, and that could hinder it from sticking to the floor. So you might as well make your cleanup easier and put the plastic down. The easiest way to release the popcorn texture from the ceiling is to spray it with water. Back in 2019, I worked with a drywall guy on a garage ceiling popcorn texture removal job, and he was using a 1-gallon sprayer that was meant for spraying weed killer, and although it can work on popcorn ceilings with water, it took a long time to get the texture saturated enough. So I went out and bought a backpack sprayer and let him use it. By the time he was done spraying several coats of water on the popcorn texture, he ended up buying the backpack sprayer from me so he could use on all of his future texture removal jobs. Something like a 4-gallon backpack sprayer might seem a little expensive to you at $59.97 for a HDX model or $89.97 for a DeWalt model, compared to a 1-gallon HDX or Scott sprayer for $11.97 to $18.97. Saving that $40 to $48 isn't worth the amount of time you'll spend pumping and spraying something like this 241 square foot ceiling or a 400 square foot garage, as you're going to have to put 2 or 3, 4 coats of water going over that texture, because you'll see some areas will soak up more water and some areas won't soak up as much, so you'll need to spray it again. So I'll put an Amazon link in the description for the Home Depot backpack sprayer and the DeWalt backpack sprayer, and so you can check out the product on the Amazon site. Maybe you'll get a better deal. For an unpainted popcorn ceiling, you'll need to spray the ceiling with 2 to 4 coats of water, and that is why the backpack sprayer is a valuable tool to have, especially if you're doing this work as a professional where your time is worth more than the hassle of using a small sprayer that is inefficient use of your time. Would you like to walk around and spray back and forth effortlessly, or do you want to have to stop every 3 square feet and pump the 1-gallon sprayer back up and then spray another 3 square feet or so? With a backpack sprayer, you can be pumping as you're walking and spraying at the same time, so it is a much better tool in my opinion. We have not encountered a painted popcorn ceiling yet that I'm aware of, but I imagine it would take a lot longer for the water to penetrate the paint layer depending on how glossy the paint is. If anyone has professional experience with painted popcorn ceiling texture removal, please provide your experience in the comments along with the square footage of the ceiling, the soak time, etc. to help the viewers gain your knowledge, and I thank you in advance. Once you have the ceiling popcorn texture saturated, you can start scraping the ceiling. I prefer to use a 6-inch drywall taping knife. It is easy to maneuver around the ceiling obstacles such as recessed lights, AC vent covers, ceiling fans, other light fixtures of course, skylights, cabinets, and crown molding, and so much more. The popcorn texture comes off really easily when saturated, and it can come off in long strips, which is very satisfying to do. You may need to respray the ceiling with water if some areas didn't get enough or you took too long to get to that area. Scraping this 241 square foot ceiling took me 3.5 hours, and that's almost 69 square feet per hour. It took me 1 hour to tape the plastic up on the walls next to the ceiling, 1.5 hours of scraping the texture, and 1 hour to clean up the texture, roll up the plastic and all the little bits. When I get done scraping off the popcorn texture, I'll look over the entire ceiling to check for any problems or defects with the drywall sheets and joint tape. Although it might not be obvious, a lot of ceilings have some loose drywall nails, which creates some sagging or drywall nail pops. So while you're up on a ladder, I'd suggest pushing up on the ceiling to see if there is any loose drywall. If you find any loose drywall, add 1 1/4 inch coarse thread drywall screws for 1/2 inch thick drywall into the ceiling framing and hammer those nails back slightly recessed. If you have 5/8 sheetrock, it'll be 1 and 5/8 coarse thread drywall screws. If you have any metal framing, you'll use some fine thread screws. If you see any drywall cracks, you'll want to apply some new drywall joint tape. 20 plus years ago, I used to use mesh tape exclusively, but since then, I've become more fond of paper tape. Mesh tape is self-adhesive and is easy to fill, but the slightest movement in the structure will easily show the crack again. Paper tape seems to hide this problem better, and in Texas, there's a greater chance for this issue in older homes. I've learned over the past 28 plus years to add some water to the premix joint compound to make the consistency more workable for paper tape, and to use a mixer paddle to work out most of the air bubbles that you'll find in premix mud. Once you do this, it'll make your drywall life easier. You'll want to apply about 1/16 inch thick layer of mud on your drywall joints. Apply the paper tape and then use a taping knife to gently wipe out the excess mud from underneath. But be sure to keep some of that mud because that's what's creating the bond. You'll want to go over any nails or screws with a coat of mud. As a beginner, you'll probably want to fill every nail or screw individually, but as you get more comfortable with the taping knife and mud, you can go over several holes in one pass. I used to use a 6-inch, 10-inch, or 12-inch knife to float the entire ceiling, but ever since I discovered an 18-inch skimming blade, I use a 6-inch knife to put the mud on the ceiling surface, and then use an 18-inch skimming blade to make the mud look incredibly smooth. Now I own an 18-inch, a 32-inch, and a 48-inch skimming blade, which can be used in areas that don't have any obstructions. You can thank me later, because it's worth purchasing. When you're done with the initial skim coat, you have a decision to make. There is a controversial opinion about to sand or not to sand, if you've ever been on Reddit. If you are left with small ridges of mud from the mud overhanging the edge of your knife, you could scrape those off with a taping knife. If you have wide ridges or humps, you'll likely have to sand those off. For the first sanding, I would prefer to use a 120 grit sanding screen, not sandpaper, to knock down any humps quickly. The controversy is over the dust that's created. Some finishers will use a broom on the ceiling, but I still see dust when this method is used. Plus, the dust fills in small pinholes. I think the best method to use is a shop vac with 2 6-foot hoses taped together and an extension with a brush attachment at the end. When you have your ceiling all cleaned up, check the ceiling with a flashlight or a work light to look for any remaining problems. Trust me, there's always something. So get those areas fixed. One of the things that you should probably be paying attention to is the shadows that are created by the flashlight or work light. That will kind of bring your eyes, to the attention of any sort of humps. If you put that flashlight or work light right up against the ceiling and then pointing sideways, then it'll create a shadow on any humps or bumps. And of course, you have the pinholes and any other problems. So look for those shadows. That'll be your trick or your clue of where you need to continue to work on your drywall to better perfect it. Because whether you're doing a smooth ceiling or a textured ceiling, that hump or bump is going to show up later. Like if you have a textured ceiling and you go take your magic trowel, which I'll leave a link in the description. If you take a magic trowel and or a taping knife and you go over a hump, then any of that hump will kind of make that knockdown texture a little bit more flat than the other areas. So that's just going to highlight it. I've seen it plenty of times over the last 28 years. Here is where you come to a fork in the road. If your ceiling is ready for texture, then mask off the room as needed. Mix the mud to the consistency that will flow through the hopper and spray a sample texture on a scrap piece of drywall to adjust the air pressure, trigger settings, orifice size, etc. to get the desired results to match the texture that you already have in your house, or the texture that you want. If you're going for a level 4 or level 5 smooth ceiling, you will need to float a second coat of mud for sure. I usually do about 2 to 3 coats. I plan on 2 plus a touch-up, but that's because I'm using that 18-inch skimming blade, which kind of helps speed things up a little bit in the process. The ceiling then gets vacuumed again, and then check the ceiling again with a light and touch up any areas as needed. You should be ready for primer now. This 241 square foot kitchen and breakfast area took me a little over 34 hours to refinish the ceiling, not including the ceiling patches from a pantry, a recessed fluorescent light, any access holes, or any other drywall work on this project. To summarize the sealing process, it took 3.5 hours to mask off, scrape, and clean up the popcorn texture. There was an unknown amount of time to secure the loose drywall and fix bad drywall joint tape. There was 9.75 hours to float and sand the first coat, 12.33 hours to float and sand the second coat, 5 hours to touch up one floated area and tiny blemishes, 1.25 hours to cut the popcorn texture in a straight line and scrape carefully between a popcorn ceiling texture in one room and the new smooth ceiling in the kitchen. This does not include any drywall hole patching, floating, sanding, or texturing that was done in other areas of this project. Now, one thing you should be aware of from the beginning is that houses from about 1978 and older could have asbestos in the ceiling texture. So if your house is around 1979 or earlier, you should get your texture tested prior to the removal so you don't end up breathing in dangerous airborne particles. Asbestos was banned in 1978. If you have a house from 1980 or newer, you should have nothing to worry about. Homes built before the 1980s were likely to contain the mineral somewhere.